Hello, good evening. I hope each and every one of you is doing well. Today we're having our youth class. Although we've opened up the church, I'm going to continue this series kind of tentatively until later notice, since we're not actually having a class on Wednesdays. Today we're actually going to be talking about money stuff. So yesterday I actually read the passage that our focus is on today. It's Matthew 6:19 to 24. Verses specifically, the core verses are Matthew 6:20 to 21. And it says, "But lay up yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where their thieves do not break in and steal. But where your treasure is, there your heart will also be." So when we're talking about what is important in life, one of the things we have to focus on is whether we focus on the material things in our life while we're here on this earth, or whether we focus on spiritual things. And Jesus here he's actually talking to his disciples, and he's speaking to this group of people, and he's telling them it's important that you don't put treasures, don't spend your whole life just pretty much working to make money or gaining stuff, buying clothes, but your focus should really be on establishing something that's eternal. Because as we all know, and particularly this current situation, it shows that none of us is really here forever. We all have a timeline, pretty much. We all have a moment where we know we won't be here any longer. And for that reason, we have to make it a goal to establish something for tomorrow. Um, for instance, we know there's a heaven. How are we going to make sure other people go to heaven and have a home in heaven? It's only when we decide to speak to those people about Christ that we'll know for sure that we've established potentially something greater than ourselves, something greater than money, than finances, because all of that will stay. You can see the tombs of great, for example, Egyptians who died thousands of years ago, and they were buried with their gold, with their things, but they weren't unable to take any of that into the afterlife. The thought was that they could, but in reality, we can't take any of it with us. So we might as well get used to that fact and begin to establish something for tomorrow. In our own lives, for example, it's important to take times of seeking God, times where we get to know God and actually get into His Word and pray. Because if we're not doing that, we're not establishing ourselves, getting prepared for a tomorrow. We're only focusing on today if we're running around, we're just focusing on school, or just focusing on work and the things that are here. If we're just focusing on our to-do list, then that's not establishing a tomorrow in Christ, a treasure in heaven, but that's establishing only here on earth. And the unfortunate thing, when we focus on that, when life is gone, there is always, I feel like, that sense of what could have happened or what God could have used you for, potentially. So I would like y'all to kind of focus on the following questions this week. They are: number one, how do your possessions reflect what's in your heart? For instance, do I have a lot of clothes that I don't wear? Do I have excessive amounts of things that I don't use? What do I focus on? For example, do I invest in material like Bibles or things that will help me grow, audiobooks, or do I invest all my stuff on material things that are here on earth and one day will end? So what we have in our possessions actually makes a difference. Question 2, in verses 22 and 23, what does Jesus mean when he refers to our eye? in these verses, there's a common Jewish phrase from this day: to have a good eye meant that you were a generous person, and to have a bad eye was a stingy or greedy person. So God was saying you need to have or be a giving person. So beyond putting so we kind of focus on what are we doing as far as speaking to people about Christ, what are we doing in our own relationship with God, and establishing something for tomorrow. But we also have to focus on, are we preaching that? Are we being generous with our finances? Are we being generous in the way that we serve God by offering and giving our tithes? Are we being generous also when we provide to others or give to others? Are you a person that holds on to money so stingy, greedy, in a stingy manner, that it shows that your focus is on money? I have seen so many people who actually, unfortunately, focus more on getting money, and what happens is, because they're always running after that money, it always runs away from them. On the contrary, when your purpose, your desire is to give to others, I think one of the reasons that some of the richest people are rich is because they're also very generous. They give out millions of dollars to charities. They help others because they understand that they're in a privileged situation. So when you are willing to have an open heart, God is capable, more than capable, of blessing you, because he sees that you are willing to put your treasures elsewhere, not only on yourself or your self-indulgence, but really on others as well. So I'd like to tell you a story about giving something up. So when we're talking about treasures, like I was just saying, it's important for us not to be greedy, but to actually be people who give, and give to others, and give to the kingdom of God. And then we can't be greedy with our time either. And actually, it's so important and essential to spend time with God in prayer and fasting, going to church as well, in listening to his word, in making sure that we are being fed spiritually. So we can't be stingy, whether it's financially or with our actual time, in any of these matters. So when I'd like you to think of maybe a time you've given up something. If you haven't, then ask God, is there something that you're asking me to give? I remember some time back, specifically, I was having some issues within the church youth group at that time. I was about like 17 years old, and some of the girls began to ignore me, and pretty much I was left without friends at that time period. And God specifically asked me to surrender forgiveness and to also give every one of them a gift. I was reluctant because honestly I was really angry and frustrated, and I felt essentially alone at church, which is maybe something some of you can kind of identify with if you've ever had a similar situation. Well, sometimes it's difficult to even surrender forgiveness. So at that moment, God asked me to forgive, and I went to the store. I bought each and every one of them a bracelet, and I gave them that gift. I could see it in their eyes. They were kind of perplexed because they had been mean to me. They had been ignoring me completely. It felt like a total clique, and I was completely out of this clique. But that moment when I decided to give up my finances, give up some time to spend buying something for people who weren't even being nice to me, and most importantly, really surrender my heart and give forgiveness, I felt free. I felt completely free of the burden of bitterness. And a lot of us will live whenever we're greedy, we only think about ourselves. It can be when somebody hurts us, it can be something that we hold in our hearts, and instead of letting go and surrendering to God, we believe that we're supposed to maybe even ignore them and let them suffer the the consequences of the things they've done to us. But God has called us to forgive and to give, even to those who may not in our minds deserve it, or who have treated us poorly. Because that's the other thing. Sometimes we think people have to deserve our forgiveness, they have to deserve the money, the help that we give them. But honestly, God gave us so much without us deserving it, and we can't hold on to what we have thinking that somebody has to deserve it. For instance, one of the things, particularly when talking about finances, and I know most of y'all are young, but it's important to think about your tithes. For example, you may think, and I've heard phrases of people complain that potentially they're just spending my money, the church is not really doing anything with it, why should I give my tithes? Somehow they should deserve it, or they should do certain things in order for them to deserve my tithes, in essence. But whenever we give our tithes, it's a surrender too. It's God, I'm giving it into your kingdom, believing it is going to be used for something good. I remember when I used to go to a church in Galveston, and there I would give my tithes, and understanding that it's a biblical principle that I cannot put my trust, that money cannot have an ultimate control over my life, that I have to show and demonstrate that I trust God with my finances, that I trust him with everything that I am, and that my trust isn't on this earth, but that I look to a tomorrow. And if God has told me to keep that as a principle, then I'm going to do it in whatever city, whatever country, wherever he takes me. That is going to be a principle that will always remain. And thankfully, it's been a blessing to be able to give. And I can really see God's hands over my finances continuously, because there is no holding back. There's no saying, God, I'm going to hold on to this money because I believe I've worked hard for it. But no, I understand that at the end of the day, it's all God's. And when we give it to him and we surrender it, he's actually great enough to bless us even more than we can think. And that's the principle of these words, of what he's saying in this passage in Matthew 6:20 to 21. Do lay up yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. So wherever you focus on, that is where your treasure is. If you focus on God, then your treasure is in heaven. If you focus on giving to him, your time, your finances, your heart, because sometimes we forget that we also have to surrender our heart and get healing from him, because we think that we can just live our lives without him. But I encourage you to surrender everything to God and lay up your treasure in heaven. Lay everything in him, and tomorrow, regardless of what happens in this life, and if anything, that I keep seeing with everything that's going on, nothing is for sure. None of us have our job for sure. None of us have our life for sure. None of us have anything for certain, even health. Today I spoke to somebody who has not only been severely sick, somebody who's young, and their spouse is now also was recently diagnosed with a severe illness, and now they're both struggling. And it reminds me that in this life we don't know what's going to happen, but if we lay down our lives and believe in God and a future tomorrow, then regardless of what happens, there is a tomorrow, there is hope, and there's faith and trust that whenever we leave this earth, that we will have a place in heaven. So I encourage you to focus in heaven. Don't worry about necessarily always what's here on earth. Sometimes we can focus and think like this world is forever, but it's not. I encourage you to understand and really dive deep into this thought that really this life isn't forever. And you may be 17, 20, 25, 30. Life can end at any moment, and it's not guaranteed for you and I. And that's what we should not focus on, but focus on the fact that even if, the end comes at a young, old age, whatever time it comes, we trust that tomorrow there is a place for us in heaven, and that God, when we have spent our lives surrendered to Him, He can protect us and guide us, and He has a place for us in heaven. Even more important than that is that not only do we have a place in heaven, but those loved ones, our friends, when we take the time to also speak to them about Christ. So I encourage you, remember, even in the midst of problems, even if you're struggling today, and some of you, I think, may be struggling with the fact that you've been at home for several weeks, and you may feel a little bit of anxiety and worry, and maybe you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or how long this is going to last. Trust in God, put your faith in God, and know that there is always hope in Him. I love y'all. I hope you're doing well. Please let me know if y'all need anything, and I will be in contact with you. I'm going to send a Zoom pretty much message tomorrow, so hopefully I get to see some of you. God bless you, and I hope to see you next week.